On the night of my sister's 35th birthday, in a 5-star ballroom overlooking the Chicago River, my father raised a crystal glass and called me a freeloader in front of 60 guests. Not quietly, not privately. Into a microphone. The chandeliers were dripping light over marble floors. A string quartet was playing something soft and expensive. Victoria stood beside her fiancé in a red silk gown that probably cost more than my first car. And my father decided that was the perfect moment to announce that one of his daughters had built an empire, and the other had built nothing. "That one," he said, pointing at me with the stem of his glass, "still lives off her grandmother's inheritance." Laughter rolled through the room like polite thunder. My mother leaned toward the microphone, smiling as if this were affectionate teasing. "Samantha never really learned how to stand on her own. Some people just don't have the drive." Victoria squeezed her fiancé's hand and tilted her head, sympathetic and superior all at once. I stood there in a simple black dress while 60 guests, investors, developers, socialites, distant relatives, looked at me with curiosity, pity, or quiet amusement. They thought they understood the story. They thought the small gift box I placed on the table was proof I couldn't compete. They had no idea that inside that box were documents that would freeze every smile in that ballroom. And they certainly didn't expect my lawyer to walk in right behind me. The ballroom smelled like roses and money. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Chicago skyline, glittering over the river. Every table was dressed in white linen and gold trim. Victoria had chosen the hotel because it matched the Reed legacy. That was her phrase: Reed Legacy Realty, Reed family reputation, Reed bloodline. She lived for optics. I had arrived 10 minutes late on purpose, long enough for the toast to begin, long enough for them to feel comfortable. My heels clicked against the marble as I crossed the room. I felt eyes on me before my father even called my name. It wasn't the first time I had been introduced as the underachieving daughter. It was just the first time he'd done it with a microphone and 60 witnesses. Victoria's fiancé, Mark, held his phone slightly angled toward the stage. I saw the red light of recording. Instagram story, no doubt. A carefully curated humiliation. Family accountability. He would probably caption it. My father continued, "We're so proud of Victoria. She took over her grandmother's company and turned it into something remarkable. That's what real ambition looks like." The applause came easily. "And then there's Samantha," he added with a chuckle. "Still benefiting from that trust fund your grandmother set up. Some people are just lucky, I guess." Lucky. I could feel the heat of 100 glances. Some uncomfortable, some entertained. One woman at table 4 whispered something to her husband and smirked. My mother nodded solemnly. "We always hoped she would find her way, but you can't force someone to build something." Build something? I almost smiled. For the record, I was the regional director of BMW distribution across the Midwest. 7-figure annual income, 8-figure net worth. I had built logistics networks across 3 states, negotiated fleet contracts, and overseen expansion projects worth more than my sister's entire development portfolio. But I had never corrected them publicly. I had wanted to see what they would do without knowing. Now I knew. Victoria stepped forward to take the microphone back. "Anyway," she said lightly, "we're just grateful for family support. Some people support by investing, some by existing." More laughter. Mark zoomed in slightly with his phone. I let them finish. I let the applause fade. I let the violinist awkwardly stop mid-note. Then I walked toward the head table. The gift box in my hand was small. Matte black. No ribbon, no brand name. It looked almost disappointing compared to the towering floral arrangements. Victoria noticed it and raised an eyebrow. "Oh, Sam, you didn't have to," she said sweetly. "Is it another savings bond from Grandma's inheritance? The guests laughed again, softer this time. I placed the box in front of her plate. "Open it," I said. She rolled her eyes. "Can we not do this right now?" "Open it." My voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Something in my tone shifted the air. A few conversations at nearby tables died down. Mark lowered his phone slightly. My father waved dismissively. "We'll look at it later." "No," I said calmly. "You'll look at it now." The ballroom doors opened behind me. The sound was quiet, but precise. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in a party. Measured footsteps on marble. Daniel Harper walked in carrying a slim leather briefcase. Several guests recognized him immediately. One developer at table 2 straightened in his chair. Daniel wasn't a social attorney. He was corporate litigation, structured finance, the kind of lawyer companies called when numbers turned serious. Victoria's smile flickered. "What is this?" she whispered. "Your birthday gift," I said. Daniel stopped beside me and gave a polite nod to the room. "Good evening." My father's expression shifted from amusement to irritation. "Samantha, what are you doing?" I didn't answer him. I kept my eyes on Victoria. "Open it." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with 60 guests watching and her fiancé still half recording, she reached forward and lifted the lid. Her fingers touched the top document, and the room went completely silent. Victoria stared at the top page for a full 3 seconds before she laughed. "Oh my God," she said, too brightly. "Is this supposed to be dramatic?" She lifted the first document from the box and held it between 2 manicured fingers like it might stain her. Daniel stepped forward. "If you could read the highlighted section aloud, Ms. Reed." Her smile tightened. "This is ridiculous." "Read it," I said. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the hotel's air system. Victoria cleared her throat. "Notice of mortgage assignment," she read, her voice still coated in sarcasm. "The undersigned hereby confirms transfer of beneficial interest in the property located at—" Her eyes dropped to the address. "The Lake Forest Mansion." Her voice faltered for half a second, then resumed. "From First Midwest Lending to Reed Asset Holdings, LLC." She blinked. "What is Reed Asset Holdings?" I met her gaze. Mine. A murmur rippled through the tables. Daniel continued smoothly. "The property has been in default for 6 consecutive months. The original lender elected to sell the distressed note. My client acquired it." My father stepped forward. "That's impossible! We're in restructuring talks." Daniel didn't even look at him. "The restructuring window expired last quarter." Victoria flipped to the second page, faster now. Her hands were no longer steady. It says, lien holder," she muttered. "Yes," I said. "I'm the lien holder." My mother's wine glass trembled against the table. "Samantha, what is this?" "It means," I said calmly, "the mansion is no longer practically yours." The words hung there. Someone at the back whispered, "Foreclosure." Victoria's laugh came out sharp. "You're bluffing." Daniel opened his briefcase and removed a stamped copy. "Recorded with Lake County this morning." My father's face flushed red. "You went behind our backs?" "You said I lived off Grandma's inheritance," I replied. "I invested it." The first wave of shock hadn't even settled when Victoria grabbed the next stack of documents. "What is this?" she demanded. "Keep reading." "Vehicle repossession notice," she read, slower now. "Due to delinquency on financing agreement." Her eyes flicked to Mark. 3 VIN numbers were listed below. The Range Rover, the Porsche, the Mercedes. "That's the company line of credit," Mark snapped. "That's not personal." "It was secured by company assets," I said, and I acquired the company's outstanding debt package. Victoria's voice went thin. You can't just take our cars. I already did. Right on cue, my assistant Ethan appeared near the entrance of the ballroom, his phone pressed discreetly to his ear. He caught my eye and gave a small nod. The tow trucks are scheduled, I said softly. They should be at your condo garage by now. A few guests actually gasped. Mark stepped toward me. This is sabotage. You set this up. No, I said evenly. You did. 4 months of missed payments. That's not sabotage. That's math. Victoria's face had lost all color. She turned to the final stack inside the box. The thickest one. Her fingers hesitated before lifting it. Controlling share acquisition agreement, she read. The words seemed to weigh more than the paper. That's forged, she whispered. Daniel shook his head. The company's largest creditor position was sold last week. My client purchased it and converted the debt to equity. Under the bylaws of Reed Legacy Realty, that grants controlling shares. The ballroom no longer felt festive. It felt like a courtroom. You don't own my company, Victoria said, louder now. Grandma left it to me. Grandma left you leadership, I said. You used it as collateral. Mark grabbed the document and scanned it quickly. His jaw tightened. This is coercion. It's business, Daniel replied. Victoria flipped through pages, her breathing shallow. 3 consecutive years of operational losses, she read under her breath. Over-leveraged developments, vendor arrears. You've been bleeding cash, I said. You just hid it well. That's not your concern, my father snapped. It became my concern when the lenders started calling. Silence settled again, heavier this time. I didn't take anything from you, I said, my voice steady enough to carry across the room without a microphone. I bought what you gambled away. My mother stiffened. What did you just say? Victoria froze. There's more in the box, I added. Daniel handed her a final sheet. Preliminary financial review, he said. Her eyes moved quickly over the page, then slower. Trust withdrawals? She whispered. I didn't elaborate. Wire transfers from the Margaret Reed Family Trust, Daniel clarified. Repeated over the past 2 years. My mother's chair scraped loudly against the marble floor. That has nothing to do with this, she said. It has everything to do with this, I replied. The same months Reed Legacy Realty missed vendor payments, there were large withdrawals routed to an account in Nevada. My father's fists clenched. Careful. I am, I said quietly. A developer at table 3 stood up abruptly, excusing himself from the room. The air had changed. People were no longer watching for entertainment. They were watching for implications. Victoria's voice broke. You're destroying this family. No, I said. You did that when you signed inflated invoices and called it growth. Mark's phone, still in his hand, slowly lowered. The red recording light disappeared. Daniel closed his briefcase. Formal notices will be delivered tomorrow morning, he announced. Executive authority transfers effective immediately pending board confirmation. All major financial accounts are frozen. My father stepped toward me as if he might grab my arm, but hotel security had already moved closer, subtle but firm. You think this makes you powerful? He hissed. No, I said. It makes me solvent. Victoria looked down at the documents scattered in front of her birthday cake. 60 guests stood frozen around white-clothed tables, crystal glasses untouched. The string quartet didn't know whether to pack up or keep playing. I stepped back from the table. This was your gift, I said softly. Transparency. Victoria's hands were still resting on the paper when I turned away. Behind me, someone whispered the word bankruptcy, and for the first time that night, no one laughed. I woke up to my phone vibrating nonstop on the nightstand. Notifications stacked over each other. Texts, emails, mentions, missed calls. Victoria had posted at 3 in the morning. The video was cleanly edited. Slow zoom on my father's toast. The line about me, living off grandma's inheritance. Laughter. A cropped clip of me placing the black gift box on the table. No documents. No lawyer. No mortgage assignment. The caption read, "When your own sister tries to steal the family business on your birthday." Underneath it, "Betrayal hurts more when it's blood." The comments were split. Some called me ruthless, greedy, power-hungry. Others asked what she wasn't showing. Mark had reshared it with a shorter caption, "Protect what's yours." By 8 a.m., a local real estate blog had picked it up. Headline, "Reed Legacy Family Feud Turns Ugly." I made coffee and watched it all unfold without responding. If Victoria had posted at 3 in the morning, that meant she'd prepared something in advance, which meant she'd anticipated exposure, which meant she knew more about the company's instability than she'd ever admitted. My phone rang again. "Daniel." "They're shaping a narrative," he said calmly. "Emotional betrayal sells faster than financial documentation." "I know." "We'll respond strategically, not emotionally." "I'm not emotional," I said, staring at the skyline outside my condo window. That wasn't entirely true. I wasn't angry. I was focused. By mid-morning, investors had started emailing Reed Legacy Realty asking for clarification. 2 wanted emergency meetings. 1 requested formal confirmation of my controlling share position. My father gave a short interview to a minor radio host before noon. I listened to the clip. "She's unstable," he said. "Obsessed with money. This isn't how family resolves things." My mother added softly, "We're worried about her." I almost laughed. Worried. At 11:27, a new email appeared in my inbox. No sender name. Encrypted routing. The subject line was one sentence. "Check the Vegas withdrawals." There was an attachment. I downloaded it and opened the file. Screenshots of wire transfers from the Margaret Reed Family Trust. Dates spanning 2 years. Recurring amounts. 6 figures each time. The receiving bank was in Nevada. My pulse didn't spike. It narrowed. I cross-referenced the dates with archived board meeting notes and internal company reports. 3 of the withdrawals matched months when Reed Legacy Realty had delayed vendor payments. 1 aligned with the quarter Victoria had claimed cash flow was temporarily tight. Another fell on a weekend my parents had said they were visiting friends in Wisconsin. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the pattern. This wasn't mismanagement. It was systemic. I forwarded the file to Daniel with a single line. "Run this," he called within minutes. "If these are legitimate," he said, "this escalates everything." "They're legitimate," I replied. "The formatting matches the bank portal." "Then this isn't just corporate debt. This is trust misuse." By early afternoon, Victoria posted again. This time it was a longer video. She was seated in what looked like her living room, eyes glossy but composed. "My sister has always resented that I was chosen to run our grandmother's company," she said to the camera. "Now she's manipulating legal loopholes to strip it away." "Legal loopholes." "She's weaponizing money," Victoria continued. "She's trying to erase our family." The comments were angrier this time. Someone tagged me directly. "Freeloader turned tyrant." I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to Daniel's office on LaSalle Street. We sat across from each other in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown traffic. "3 tracks," he said, sliding a legal pad toward me. "Forensic audit," I said. He nodded. "Immediate. Cease and desist for defamation. Already drafted. And if she escalates publicly?" He held my gaze. "We release evidence selectively. Not everything. Just enough." I thought about the phone call from 2 months ago. Victoria had called late, complaining about a stalled development project. If I move the vendor line, no one will notice until next quarter, she'd said. My corporate compliance software recorded calls automatically when business matters were discussed. I hadn't needed it then. I pulled up the archived file now. We listened to her voice in the quiet room. There it was. Not accidental, not ambiguous, deliberate. There was a second voice in the background. Mark, laughing. Daniel leaned back slowly. Intent, he said. That evening, we sent a controlled evidence packet to 3 major investors. No press, no public release, just facts. Debt conversion documentation, board bylaws, a partial transcript from the recorded call. Within 24 hours, 2 investors withdrew their support from Victoria. The Real Estate Regulatory Board requested compliance documents. Mark's brokerage firm emailed, asking for clarification on financial disclosures. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. You're trying to ruin my engagement. I typed a response. You did that yourself. Then I deleted it. No response was stronger. Late that night, Daniel called again. We confirmed the trust withdrawals, he said. Authorized signature traces back to your father. I closed my eyes for a moment. And? I asked. And one of the larger transfers occurred the same month Reed Legacy Realty defaulted on a contractor payment. The pieces weren't separate anymore. They were connected. My phone rang again. This time it was my mother. Her voice sounded thinner than usual. You don't understand what your father is capable of when he's cornered, she said quietly. That depends, I replied. What exactly has he been doing? Silence on the line. Then the click of disconnection. I set the phone down and looked at the city lights outside my window. They thought I had declared war in a ballroom. They hadn't seen me defend myself yet. 3 days after the birthday party, forensic accountants walked into Reed Legacy Realty carrying banker boxes and silver laptops. No raised voices, no drama, just quiet authority. I followed them through the glass doors of the office building on Wacker Drive for the first time, not as a guest, not as the underestimated sister, but as controlling shareholder. The receptionist looked at me like she wasn't sure whether to say welcome or sorry. Good morning, I said evenly. Conference room B is reserved for the audit team. Victoria's office door was closed at the end of the hall. Her name was still etched in brushed gold beside it. That would change. We gathered in the main conference room at 9 sharp. Daniel sat to my right. 2 forensic auditors spread out documents across the table like surgeons preparing instruments. Victoria entered 10 minutes late. She didn't sit. You cannot do this, she said, voice already sharp. You ambushed me with paperwork and now you're staging a corporate coup. I slid a folder across the table. Under the bylaws, I said. Executive authority transfers with controlling shares. Pending audit completion, you're suspended from financial decision-making. Her eyes flashed. This is my company. It was Grandma's, I replied. You leveraged it. Daniel handed her the formal suspension letter. She didn't take it at first. When she finally did, she crushed it slightly in her hand without looking down. Mark appeared in the doorway behind her. You're abusing a technicality, he said. One of the auditors spoke calmly. We'll need full access to financial drives and vendor accounts immediately. Victoria laughed once, hollow. You think you'll find something? We don't think, the auditor replied. We verify. IT confirmed that several financial folders had been accessed remotely at 2 a.m. the night before. Who has remote credentials? I asked. Victoria didn't answer. Mark looked at the floor. By noon, the first discrepancies surfaced. Duplicate contractor invoices submitted under slightly altered vendor names, identical formatting, Same contact numbers. Payments routed through a consulting LLC registered to Mark. The total was in the high six figures. Victoria's jaw tightened when the numbers were read aloud. That was temporary reallocation, she said. Cash flow smoothing. You billed the company twice for the same landscaping project, I said quietly. That's not smoothing. Her gaze snapped to mine. You've always been jealous. There it was. Not fear, not remorse. Jealousy. As if this were still about sibling rivalry and not financial misconduct. By mid-afternoon, the auditors shifted to the trust review. Daniel projected a spreadsheet on the conference room screen. Wire transfers from the Margaret Reed Family Trust. Large amounts. Repeated intervals. The receiving bank located in Las Vegas. Victoria stared at the screen. Why is that here? Because company liquidity and trust withdrawals overlap, Daniel said. One transfer was dated the same week Reed Legacy Realty failed to pay quarterly tax deposits. Another aligned with a stalled condominium project that Victoria had publicly labeled strategic delay. Bridge loan, she muttered under her breath, reading the memo line on one transfer. From a trust? I asked. Silence. I stepped out of the room briefly and called my father. You authorized withdrawals from Grandma's trust, I said when he answered. It was temporary, he snapped. We were protecting the company. You told me there was no money available to stabilize vendor payments. You had no right to question us. I ended the call before he could continue. When I returned to the conference room, one of the auditors was reviewing internal emails. A thread between Victoria and Mark appeared on the screen. Move vendor line to Q3, Victoria had written. No one will notice until next quarter. Mark's reply. As long as marketing funds clear through the LLC. Intent, not incompetence. Outside the conference room, whispers began to spread among staff. By late afternoon, the Real Estate Regulatory Board had contacted the office requesting compliance documentation related to recent transactions. Victoria's phone rang repeatedly. She silenced it each time. It's just paperwork, she said finally, though her voice had lost its edge. The CFO, pale and sweating, asked to speak privately. In my office now, he confessed that Victoria had instructed him to delay vendor payments and reclassify certain expenses to mask liquidity issues. I warned her, he said. She said the market would rebound. And Mark? I asked. He pushed for aggressive leverage, said growth was optics. Optics. Everything had been optics. When Victoria learned the regulatory board was reviewing her license, she went very still. That's temporary, she said. They always review during disputes. An email notification appeared on Daniel's laptop. Interim suspension pending investigation. Victoria stared at the screen like it was written in another language. Mark stormed out of the building before anyone could speak to him. By evening, I called an emergency staff meeting. The conference room filled again, this time with agents and support staff. I know this week has been chaotic, I said. Payroll will continue. Projects under review will be assessed transparently. We are stabilizing, not dissolving. An older leasing manager in the back raised her hand. It's been unstable for a while, she said quietly. Thank you. Victoria didn't attend that meeting. When I left the building after dark, my mother was waiting by the curb. Her eyes were red. You're taking this too far, she said. She's your sister. When you called me a freeloader, I replied, did you already know about the trust withdrawals? Her lips parted. No words came out. She turned away first. Later that night, Daniel called. The board has issued formal interim suspension of her real estate license, he said. If the audit confirms misrepresentation, it could become permanent. And the mansion? I asked. Foreclosure date is now official. I stood by my window overlooking the city. They humiliated me under chandeliers and champagne. Now their empire was collapsing under fluorescent lights. The foreclosure notice became official on a gray Monday morning. Daniel slid the final authorization form across his desk toward me. "Once you sign this, the enforcement timeline begins," he said. Outside his office window, Chicago traffic crawled through sleet. Inside, the room was quiet enough that I could hear the scratch of my pen when I signed my name. Reed Asset Holdings, LLC. My company, my decision. There was still a narrow option to restructure the mortgage and extend the loan, to quietly save the Lake Forest mansion, and pretend none of this had happened. Daniel didn't say it, but the choice sat between us. I capped the pen. "No restructuring," I said. "Proceed." 10 days later, I drove up the circular driveway of the mansion I had grown up in. The iron gates were open. The stone facade looked exactly as it always had, imposing, curated, expensive. It had been presented to the world as proof that the Reed family was untouchable. Daniel stepped out of the car behind me, followed by a court-appointed representative carrying a folder. My father opened the front door before we even reached the steps. "You've got nerve," he said, not bothering with hello. "I have paperwork," I replied. My mother appeared in the foyer, her face pale but composed. "Samantha, this is absurd. We're in negotiations." "No," Daniel corrected gently. "You were. The lender sold the note." My father's jaw tightened. "To her. To the highest bidder," Daniel said. I walked past them into the foyer. The marble floors reflected the chandelier light just like they had on every Christmas morning of my childhood. "You're choosing money over family!" my father snapped. "You chose Vegas over Grandma's trust," I said. The words landed hard. My mother's hand gripped the banister. "Those withdrawals were temporary. We were going to replace the funds." "With what?" I asked. "The same cash flow you were hiding from vendors?" She flinched. Daniel opened the folder and handed my father a copy of the court filing. "Writ of possession scheduled in 10 days. You have until then to vacate." My father laughed, but it was brittle. "You think you can throw us out of our own house?" "It's not your house," I said quietly. "Not anymore." Victoria's heels clicked across the foyer tiles before I even saw her. She must have been upstairs. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. "Enforcing a contract," I replied. She looked exhausted, dark circles under perfectly applied makeup. Her phone was clutched tightly in her hand. "My license hearing is next week," she said. "Mark's brokerage suspended him. You've done enough." "You inflated contractor invoices," I said. "That wasn't my doing." She stepped closer. "You could have handled this privately." "You handled my humiliation publicly." Silence thickened between us. Daniel cleared his throat. "There's also the matter of the attempted property transfer." My father stiffened. "What transfer?" my mother asked sharply. 2 days ago, Daniel said. Mr. Reed attempted to transfer ownership of the Oak Brook rental property to a relative. We filed an emergency injunction. The court granted a temporary restraining order. My mother turned to my father slowly. "You did what?" He didn't answer. "You were going to hide assets," I said. "From creditors. From me." He finally looked at me, and for the first time there was something like desperation in his eyes. "I was protecting what's left." "From consequences?" I asked. Victoria's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and went pale. "What now?" my father demanded. She swallowed. "The board issued interim suspension, effective immediately." Her voice broke on the last word. I watched the shift happen. The confidence drain. The realization settle. My engagement venue just called, she added quietly. The deposit check didn't clear. Mark wasn't here. I didn't ask where he was. This didn't have to go this far, my mother said, tears threatening now. We are your parents. And I was your daughter when you called me a freeloader, I said. 10 days later, the sheriff's vehicle sat discreetly at the curb while moving trucks lined the driveway. No one screamed. No one caused a scene. Humiliation doesn't always shout. Sometimes it stands in silence while neighbors pretend not to watch. My mother supervised as movers carried boxes past her. My father paced near the garage. Victoria removed framed photos from the walls, stacking them without looking at them. When I stepped into the living room, the space already felt hollow. This is your fault, my father muttered as the sheriff handed him final paperwork. No, the sheriff said evenly. This is a court order. The last box went into the truck just before sunset. My mother paused at the doorway. Where are we supposed to go? She asked. You signed a lease last week, I said. You'll be fine. Victoria stopped beside her. For a moment, she looked at me as if she might say something real. Instead, she said, Was it worth it? Yes, I answered. They drove away in a rented sedan. I walked back inside the empty mansion. The echo was immediate. No furniture, no voices, no inherited expectations hanging in the air. Just space. I moved slowly through the rooms, ending in the basement. The place I had once been told to stay during parties. Out of sight. Out of embarrassment. Now it was empty concrete and possibility. My phone buzzed. The contractor. If we modernize the structure and rework the lower level into a private showroom, he said, you're looking at a resale bump north of $2 million. I'll send the design plans tonight, I replied. When I stepped outside, the sheriff had already left. I locked the front door myself. The click of the deadbolt sounded final. As I walked down the driveway, my phone buzzed again with a news alert. Reed Legacy Realty under regulatory investigation. I didn't slow down. They had called me a freeloader. Now they were tenants of consequences. 2 weeks after the eviction, I stood at the head of the boardroom table that used to belong to my grandmother. The name on the frosted glass still read, Reed Legacy Realty. That would change soon. 8 board members sat around the table, some stiff, some wary, all aware that the woman they once dismissed as irrelevant now held controlling shares. Let's begin, I said. No speeches, no theatrics. I moved quickly. Effective immediately. The executive committee is dissolved. We are restructuring operations under interim management. The CFO position was terminated that morning. Compliance officer replaced. External auditing firm retained on contract. One board member cleared his throat. Is this retaliation or stabilization? Stabilization, I replied. Retaliation is emotional. This is arithmetic. Daniel distributed copies of the finalized forensic audit. The findings were no longer preliminary. Inflated contractor invoices, marketing funds routed through Marks Consulting LLC, misrepresentation of occupancy rates in at least one development project, cash flow reclassification to conceal shortfalls. Victoria had signed off on every major discrepancy. She's willing to settle, Daniel said. Civilly. That had surprised me. To avoid full criminal referral, Victoria agreed to personal liability acknowledgement and structured repayment. Mark, however, was under formal state investigation. I authorized settlement rather than criminal escalation. Not mercy, efficiency. Dragging this through court for years would bleed the company further. She keeps her freedom, one board member said carefully. She loses control, I answered. That's the point. By the end of the meeting, the path forward was clear. We divided the company into 3 focused divisions: sustainable mixed-use housing projects in urban corridors, commercial leasing stabilization for underperforming properties, strategic land banking for long-term equity. 2 high-risk condominium developments were canceled immediately. We liquidated non-performing parcels to restore liquidity. Quarterly transparency reports would now be public to investors. An outside COO was hired within a week. No family ties, no history, just credentials. The office felt different within days. Less tense, less performative. Employees who had once kept their heads down began speaking up. An older leasing manager approached me in the hallway. "It hasn't felt stable in years," she said quietly. "Thank you." I nodded, but I didn't let it go to my head. This wasn't gratitude. It was relief. Victoria sent a single text that week. Was it worth it? I stared at the screen for a long moment before locking the phone without responding. 8 weeks into restructuring, the mansion renovation began. I walked through it with the contractor and an architect, both discussing finishes and structural updates, as if this house had never been the epicenter of family mythology. We stripped out dated fixtures, modernized the kitchen, reworked the main floor for open concept flow, and the basement. I stood in the empty concrete space and imagined glass shelving, curated lighting, climate-controlled storage, a private wine showroom. The room where I had once been told to stay out of sight would become the most valuable feature of the property. Symbolism wasn't my objective, but I didn't ignore it either. The contractor ran numbers. "With the updates in location, you're looking at resale north of $2 million over your acquisition." I nodded. "Make it clean. No sentimental design." I wasn't renovating a childhood. I was repositioning an asset. 8 months passed in disciplined rhythm. Early mornings, board meetings, site visits, BMW regional strategy calls, financial modeling sessions that stretched late into the night. Reed Legacy Realty posted its first profitable quarter in 3 years. The investor call was different this time. Measured optimism replaced defensive explanations. We exceeded projected revenue by a margin large enough to reset confidence. A business journal ran a piece on the turnaround. The headline avoided the word scandal. That mattered. My BMW Midwest division announced record regional sales tied to expanded EV infrastructure partnerships. My net worth quietly increased as equity conversion appreciated under stabilization. For the first time in a long time, I stopped checking Victoria's social media. Not out of avoidance, out of irrelevance. Mark's investigation progressed slowly through regulatory channels. Victoria's license suspension remained in place pending final hearing. I heard through industry contacts that she had moved into a short-term rental downtown. Smaller. Temporary. My parents had signed a lease in a modest suburban apartment complex. I didn't drive past. One afternoon, Daniel called. "The trust investigation is nearing resolution," he said. "Your parents will likely face civil repayment terms. And criminal. Unlikely, if restitution continues." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I didn't want prison for them. I wanted accountability. The mansion renovation wrapped in early fall. Staged furniture replaced moving boxes. The wine showroom glowed under soft recessed lighting. When the first serious buyer toured, I didn't attend. I let the numbers speak. That evening, I stood alone in the boardroom after everyone had left. The city lights reflected off the glass walls. The sign still read, "Reed Legacy Realty." I walked to the window and traced the skyline with my eyes. They thought taking control would make me ruthless. It made me precise. It made me disciplined. It made me free. My phone buzzed with a message from the listing agent. "We have a strong offer." I didn't smile. I simply replied, "Send the contract." The offer came in clean. No contingencies beyond inspection. Closing in 30 days. Price well above projections. I read the purchase agreement once. Then again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to feel the finality of it. The Lake Forest mansion would no longer carry my last name in whispered conversations. It would become someone else's symbol. I drove there alone before signing. The house was staged now. Neutral tones, curated art, polished stone. The basement wine showroom glowed under soft lighting, glass racks lined with bottles placed for aesthetic weight rather than memory. I walked through each room slowly. The dining room where my father once lectured about reputation. The living room where Victoria practiced presentation pitches in front of mirrored panels. The staircase where my mother used to adjust her necklace before charity galas. None of it felt personal anymore, just square footage. In the basement, I paused. This had been my assigned space when guests visited. The quiet zone, the polite exile. Now it was the most marketable feature in the house. The irony didn't sting. It steadied me. I signed the contract that afternoon. Daniel reviewed the numbers once more. Net profit exceeds projections by over $2 million, he said. Good, I replied. The funds would be routed directly into a new investment vehicle aligned with the EV infrastructure expansion tied to my BMW regional operations. Assets moving forward. No sentimental holding. The inspection passed without issue. Closing day arrived under a clear sky. I didn't attend the final walkthrough. I signed electronically from my office downtown. When the wire confirmation came through, I felt something close. Not triumphant, not nostalgic. Complete. That same week, Daniel called regarding the trust investigation. It's resolved, he said. Civil settlement, structured repayment, no criminal referral. My parents had agreed to restitution in exchange for avoiding prosecution. There's a condition, Daniel added. They must relinquish any managerial claims and cease public defamation permanently. Did they sign? I asked. Your mother did immediately. Your father hesitated. I wasn't surprised. He'll sign, Daniel said. He doesn't have leverage anymore. Victoria emailed 2 days later. Subject line, dinner. She wrote that she wanted peace before the final board vote confirming my permanent leadership. That she wanted to clear the air. I agreed, but on neutral ground. A public restaurant downtown. Not the mansion, not the office. She arrived early, dressed professionally but not extravagantly. There was no red silk, no cameras. She looked thinner. I never thought you'd actually follow through, she said after we ordered. I know, I replied. She stirred her water absently. Mark's gone. I heard. He says I pressured him into aggressive leverage. She gave a hollow laugh. Convenient. You signed the invoices, I said quietly. She didn't argue. For a moment, she looked at me not as a rival, not as an enemy, but as someone she no longer recognized. You could reinstate me, she said finally. Not as CEO, just advisory. I built relationships. You built optics, I answered. Trust is built differently. Her shoulders sagged. This didn't have to end like this, she said. It didn't start with me, I replied. We paid separately. When she stood to leave, she paused. Was it worth it? She asked again. Yes, I said. A week later, the board convened for the final vote. 8 months after takeover, the atmosphere was entirely different. No tension, no whispers. Motion to confirm Samantha Reed as permanent CEO, one member stated. Unanimous approval. The decision was recorded without applause, but with certainty. After the meeting, I requested one final change. Remove legacy from the name. The board hesitated only briefly. Reed Urban Group. Shorter, cleaner, forward-facing. No more inherited mythology. Just business. The mansion sale closed officially the following morning. The funds transferred into the EV expansion fund as planned. BMW Midwest announced a new partnership aligned with sustainable infrastructure projects. The press release mentioned my leadership by name, not as someone's daughter, as an executive. Through industry contacts, I learned Victoria had taken on freelance real estate work, smaller rental properties, commission-based deals. My parents had moved into a modest apartment complex in a Chicago suburb. Occasional rumors surfaced about visits to local casinos. I didn't verify them. One afternoon, I received the final trust settlement document. Signed. My father's signature was firm but slightly uneven. No note attached. No apology. No explanation. Just ink. I placed the document in a file drawer and closed it. That evening, I stood in my office alone after everyone had left. The new company logo reflected faintly on the glass wall. Reed Urban Group. I didn't destroy my past. I liquidated it. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall over the city, and for the first time in a long time, there was nothing left to reclaim. 1 year after the night my father called me a freeloader, I sat at a corner table inside a Michelin star restaurant overlooking Michigan Avenue while snow drifted past the windows in soft silence. The lighting was low and warm. Crystal glasses caught reflections of the city. Conversations around us were hushed, elegant, contained. Across from me sat Daniel Brooks, a cardiologist with steady hands and a habit of listening more than he spoke. "Chicago looks different in December," he said, glancing toward the window. "It does," I replied. It felt different too. Not because the skyline had changed, because I had. The restaurant was calm, nothing like the ballroom chaos from a year earlier. No microphones, no public declarations, no strategic humiliations dressed up as family humor. Just quiet. Daniel reached for his water. "Do you ever miss them?" he asked gently. I considered the question instead of deflecting it. "I miss the version of family I thought I had," I said. "Not the version that existed." He nodded, not pressing further. Outside, through the tall glass window, movement caught my attention. A familiar silhouette stood across the street near a row of parked cars. Victoria. She was dressed professionally but modestly. Navy coat, portfolio tucked under her arm. She was speaking to a young couple, pointing toward a nearby rental building. No red silk, no champagne, just commission work. A few feet behind her, my parents stood beside a small sedan. My father held a handful of scratch-off lottery tickets. My mother's hands moved sharply as they argued. I didn't need to hear them to understand the pattern. Daniel followed my gaze. "Do you know them?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. My mother looked up then. For a moment, our eyes met through layers of glass and snowfall. She hesitated, as if waiting, as if expecting me to stand up, walk outside, repair something. Daniel studied my face. "Do you want to talk to them?" I leaned back in my chair. The memory came fast and clear. My father under chandeliers, raising a crystal glass. That one still lives off her grandmother's inheritance. Laughter, Victoria's smile, the weight of 60 guests judging my worth in real time. Then the gift box, the silence, the shift. I looked back at the present. Victoria finished her explanation to the couple. My father gestured sharply with the lottery tickets. My mother's shoulders were tense. Daniel's voice was soft. "You don't owe anyone a scene." "I know," I said. I lifted my wine glass slowly. The snow outside thickened. "I'm not angry anymore," I said quietly. "And I'm not responsible either." The waiter approached and, sensing the draft from the window, gently pulled the velvet curtain across our section for privacy. The view of the street disappeared. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. "You look peaceful," he said. "I am," I replied. My phone buzzed with a notification from Reed Urban Group. Quarterly earnings exceeded projections again. I silenced it without reading further. For once, business could wait. I thought about everything that had happened over the year. The humiliation, the mortgage assignment, the audit, the eviction, the restructuring, the sale. None of it had been about destruction. It had been about boundaries. Family is not a lifetime contract without terms. Inheritance is not immunity from accountability. Blood is not permission. I didn't destroy them. I enforced consequences. I stopped financing dysfunction. I stopped auditioning for approval. Outside, engines started. Doors closed. Life moved on. I didn't step outside that night, and that was the point. They once introduced me as the daughter who built nothing. Now I was the woman who rebuilt everything, and didn't need an audience to prove it. If you've ever been called a freeloader for setting boundaries, if you've ever been told you built nothing when you were quietly building everything, I hope you remember this. You don't owe anyone proof of your worth. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't loud. It's walking away, solvent, steady, and unbothered. If this story felt familiar, tell me where you're watching from this season. If you believe in boundaries over guilt, stay here. There are more stories about reclaiming your name, your money, and your peace. And sometimes, the quiet ones are the most powerful of all.